This video is about the Smithsonian's Mound records, the century-old reports that supposedly hid a race of American giants, and the federal review that dragged those records back into the headlines in the summer of 2026. What follows is the real story of what the government's own scientists wrote down, what they later threw out, and why a brand new document from the White House convinced a lot of people that something had been quietly removed all over again. Here's the fact that starts everything. In the 1880s, field agents working for a federal bureau housed inside the Smithsonian cut into ancient burial mounds across the eastern United States, and in their official government report, they described pulling a human skeleton out of the Tennessee dirt that measured 7 feet 3 inches from skull to toe. They wrote, in plain print, that the living man had probably stood a full 7.5 feet tall. That measurement was published, paid for by an act of Congress, and filed in Washington, where anyone with a library card could read it. And then, roughly a decade later, the very same bureau released a second report that quietly erased the one idea those bones seemed to promise. No lost race, no ancient giants, just Native Americans, some of them unusually tall, buried exactly where their descendants had always said they were buried. Somebody did remove something from the Mound record. The strange part, the part almost nobody tells you correctly, is what actually got removed, who removed it, and why a document dated 2026 hauled the whole fight back into the daylight. You've almost certainly met this claim before, because it travels through the internet in the same shape every single time. The Smithsonian, the story goes, sits on a hidden vault of enormous bones, thousands of them, gathered up from farmers and road crews and county diggers more than a century ago and then buried a second time inside a bureaucracy that never wanted them found. 17 separate cases, the tellers insist, sit right there in the institution's own ethnology reports, and every one of them describes a skeleton taller than 7 feet, double rows of teeth, skulls stretched long and strange, jawbones broad enough to slip over a grown man's face. And in nearly every version, the bones ride to Washington in a wooden crate and are never seen again, as if the building on the National Mall were less a museum than a crypt for evidence the country wasn't supposed to see. The accusation is specific, and specificity has a way of feeling like proof. That is precisely why the legend has outlived everyone who first told it, and it is why, in July of 2026, a fresh federal report about the Smithsonian handed the whole thing a second life it never earned on the facts. To understand what got taken out of the Mound record, you have to walk back into the belief that gripped the American imagination for most of the 1800s, because it was gigantic and because it was flatly wrong. When settlers pushed west, they kept stumbling onto earthworks, tens of thousands of them, and the largest were staggering. Take Cahokia, across the river from modern St. Louis. Its central earthwork, Monk's Mound, rises roughly 100 feet, spreads across about 14 acres, and covers a base comparable to the Great Pyramid of Giza, all of it carried up by hand in woven baskets around the year 1050. At its height, the city around it may have held 20,000 people, more than London held at the same moment in time. The settlers looked at all of that and refused the obvious answer. They decided the mounds were simply too grand, too geometric, too impressive to have been raised by the ancestors of the very people being driven off that land. So they conjured a vanished civilization instead. That invented civilization took whatever shape the moment needed. Sometimes it was a lost white race. Sometimes it was one of the lost tribes of Israel, wandered somehow into Ohio. And sometimes, most thrilling of all, it was a race of giants who had built the mounds in a golden age and then been slaughtered by the savages who came after. It sounds like harmless folklore now. In its own century, it was anything but harmless because the Mound Builder myth did a specific job. If a superior, older race had built and then lost the continent first, then the men seizing it in the 1800s were not conquerors displacing anyone. They were heirs, taking back what savagery had stolen from a nobler people. The story wiped away the guilt of removal and replaced it with the flattery of inheritance, The whole country, in effect, signed that permission slip, and the giants were one of the signatures. Picture the scene at its peak on a raw autumn morning in 1869 on a farm outside the little hamlet of Cardiff in upstate New York. Two laborers digging a well behind Stub Newell's barn strike stone 3 feet down, clear the soil, and uncover the shape of a foot, then a leg, then the whole 10-foot form of a naked stone man lying in the earth. Word tears across the Onondaga Valley within hours. Within days, thousands of people are streaming out from Syracuse and the surrounding farms, paying 50 cents a head, roughly the price of a movie ticket today, to file past what the newspapers are already calling a petrified giant, an American Goliath risen out of the ground to prove the book of Genesis, right where it says, "There were giants in the earth in those days." Preachers sermonized on it. The giant even collected a few write-in votes in that November's local elections. It was, for one delirious season, the most sensational news item in the entire country. It was also a total fraud, and the way it fell apart tells you everything about the appetite it fed. The Cardiff Giant was the creation of a New York tobacconist and card cheat named George Hull, an atheist who had cooked up the whole scheme after losing an argument with a preacher about whether the Bible's giants were literally real. Hull had quarried a 10-foot block of gypsum in Iowa, shipped it to a Chicago stonecutter to be carved into a man, aged the surface with acid and darning needles to fake the pores of skin, and buried it on his cousin's farm a full year before those well diggers found exactly where he'd told them to dig. The exposure came fast once real scholars looked closely, but here's the detail that says it all. When the showman P.T. Barnum was refused a chance to buy the original, he simply had his own plaster copy carved and exhibited it a few blocks away in New York City, and his fake of a fake drew bigger crowds than the first one. A hoax of a hoax outsold the truth. That was the century Cyrus Thomas was about to walk into with a shovel and a measuring tape. Into that climate walked the man who would spend a decade tearing the myth apart, and his name deserves to be remembered far better than it is. In 1879, the government created the Bureau of American Ethnology inside the Smithsonian and handed it to John Wesley Powell, the one-armed Civil War veteran who had already turned himself into a national legend by running the rapids of the Grand Canyon in a wooden boat. Powell had no patience whatsoever for the lost race fantasy. He called it a romantic fallacy to its face. When Congress set aside $5,000 a year expressly to investigate the mounds, Powell handed the survey to a former entomologist named Cyrus Thomas. And here's the detail that quietly dismantles the modern conspiracy before it can stand up. Thomas did not begin as a skeptic at all. He walked in as a believer in the lost race, expecting to prove the mound builders had been a separate people, and the evidence coming out of the ground slowly, stubbornly, turned him into the very man who buried them. For more than 10 years, Thomas and his agents opened mound after mound across the Ohio Valley in the South. Better than 2,000 of them by the time the project wound down. This is exactly where those unsettling measurements come from, and you need to hear it clearly because they are real. Open the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, published in 1894. Turn to page 362, and the Bureau's own men describe a skeleton from Dunleith, Illinois, lying full length on its back, between 7 and 8 feet long by actual measurement, which crumbled to pieces the instant it left the packed earth that had held it for centuries. The Roane County, Tennessee skeleton sits in the same report. That 7'3" frame the agents estimated had stood a living 7.5 feet. These are not tabloid inventions dreamed up by a hoaxer. They are federal documents printed by the government. The giant skeleton believers are right about one thing, and it is the single thing that gives their whole case its teeth. The Smithsonian's own reports really do say the Bureau's men pulled very large skeletons out of American mounds. What the believers cut away is every word Thomas wrote around those sentences. Some of that fieldwork became legend in its own right, and it repays a closer look because it shows how the myth feeds on real digging. In the winter of 1883, Colonel P.W. Norris, a former Yellowstone superintendent then working for the Bureau, sank a shaft 12 feet wide into the top of the Criel Mound in South Charleston, West Virginia, the second largest mound in the whole state, a structure raised by the Adena people somewhere between 1,000 and 200 years before Christ. Down through the layers he went, past later burials near the surface, until he reached a central tomb at the base, holding a ring of skeletons arranged like spokes around one commanding figure. Retellings would later inflate that central man into a man with 19-inch shoulders, a colossus of 7.5 feet, a Kanawha Valley king. Norris himself, and Thomas after him, saw something else entirely. They saw an Adena leader buried with honor, a copper headdress, shell beads, a single flint knife, surrounded by his people. Norris died in 1885, barely 2 years after that dig, and the mound he opened still stands in a small city park today, flattened on top because somebody once ran horse races around it. The bones told a story of a powerful man. They did not tell a story of a different species. Because Thomas was never hiding those bodies. He was counting them, measuring them, and folding every last one into the single conclusion his 700-page report was engineered to deliver. The mounds were not the work of a vanished race. They were the work of the ancestors of living Native Americans in an unbroken chain that ran from the earliest earthwork builders straight through to the tribes the government was, at that exact moment, forcing off the same ground. A 7-foot skeleton is a tall human being. It is not a giant, and it is certainly not a separate people. Powell and Thomas were arguing the precise opposite of a cover-up. They were prying the mounds loose from myth and handing them back to the people who had actually built them, and the tall skeletons were simply part of an honest inventory. Historians of the field now call that 1894 report the birth of American archaeology, the moment the discipline stopped chasing phantoms and started measuring reality. The thing that got removed from the mound record was the LIE. And a great many people have never once forgiven the Bureau for taking it away. Here is where the story turns genuinely strange, because the harder the Smithsonian worked to kill the myth, the more the myth mutated in order to survive. If the institution's own scientists were the ones standing up in public to declare that giants had never existed, then to a certain cast of mind, that declaration was not the end of anything. It was the cover-up itself. The very act of debunking became, in the retelling, the proof of the crime. In 1934, the Smithsonian's leading physical anthropologist, Aleš Hrdlička, took the giant reports apart piece by piece and blamed them on what he called the will to believe, a hunger wired straight into amateur diggers who had never studied human anatomy and could not tell a decayed, spread-out, waterlogged skeleton from a colossal one. Bones that freeze can shatter and scatter. Bones left in the ground almost always lose mass and shrink rather than grow. A jawbone looks enormous, laid across a face precisely because the rest of the skull it belonged to has rotted away. None of that patient explaining ever landed, and in a way, it never could, because the myth had already learned to treat expertise as the enemy. Then the internet gave the whole thing a second engine. In 2014, a story tore across social media claiming the Smithsonian had destroyed thousands of giant skeletons on the secret orders of a shadowy committee, and it spread so far, so fast, that Reuters and the Associated Press both had to sit down and formally debunk it, tracing the tale back to a fabricated Supreme Court case and a satire website that had never pretended to be true. It did not matter. The correction reached a fraction of the people the lie had reached. That is the quiet lesson buried in this whole affair. The giant myth does not actually need the bones. It only needs the silence around them, and it reads every denial, every debunking, every missing crate, as one more door being pulled shut on the truth. Give it a real gap, and it will build a cathedral inside it. Which carries us, at last, to 2026, and to the document that made all of this feel urgent again, instead of merely old. On March 27, 2025, the President signed Executive Order 14253, titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, aimed squarely at the Smithsonian and directing officials to strip what the order called improper ideology out of the institution's museums and research centers. Then, this July, the White House Domestic Policy Council published its report on that ongoing review, a 100-plus page document called Saving America's Story. And the simple news that the federal government was now formally reviewing what the Smithsonian keeps, how it frames the American past, and what it chooses to leave out was all the oxygen the century-old legend needed to flare up one more time. The word review did the work. If the government is reopening the files, the reasoning goes, then surely the files must have been closed for a reason. So read the report, and you genuinely should, because what it actually contains is worth sitting with quietly. It is a fight over the founders and the framing, over whether the National Museum of American History still tells a story a nation can share, over exhibits and mission statements, and what a public museum owes the taxpayers who fund it to the tune of more than $1 billion a year. It is pointed, it is political, and reasonable people land on opposite sides of it. But it says nothing about mounds, nothing about giants, nothing about the Bureau of American Ethnology or Cyrus Thomas or a single 7-foot skeleton. The bridge between a live federal review in 2026 and a Victorian bone measured in 1894 exists in exactly one place, and that place is the retelling, where a real and current headline gets quietly stitched onto an old and comfortable story to make it feel freshly true. That is not evidence. That is gravity. A big enough headline pulls loose legends into its orbit. There is even a real answer to the question the legend loves most, the one that asks where all the bones went. Many of the human remains that federal and amateur collectors pulled from mounds across the 1800s and the 1900s did end up in the Smithsonian's collections, thousands of individuals, cataloged and boxed. The Smithsonian today holds the remains of roughly 10,000 people, more than any other museum in the country. They were not destroyed to hide a secret. Under the National Museum of the American Indian Act, the law Congress passed in 1989, the institution has been working, slowly and often contentiously, to inventory those remains and return them to the descendant tribes who ask for them back, the same tribes whose ancestors built the mounds in the first place. That is the actual fate of the vanished bones. Not a locked vault under Washington, but a long, unfinished act of giving the dead back to their own people. The giant myth never mentions that ending, because a repatriation is a far less thrilling story than a cover-up, even though it happens to be the true one. And so, the Mound files feel reopened, even though the reports were never actually closed. They have sat in the open for 130 years. You can pull up page 362 tonight from your phone for free. The skeleton from Dunleith is still right there on it, still 7 to 8 feet by the Bureau's own measurement, still crumbling in a sentence written by the very men accused of erasing it. The bones themselves are gone, lost the way soft, wet, 150-year-old things are always lost to time and open air. The record stayed. It stayed the whole time. And the only thing anyone ever quietly removed from that record was a story too flattering and far too convenient to be allowed to keep standing over the graves of the people who actually raised those mounds. So when a piece of history feels most airtight right at the spot where the documents supposedly fall silent, that uneasy certainty is usually your cue to go and read the documents yourself, because they are almost never as silent as the legend needs them to be. If this loosens something for you, this channel exists for exactly this kind of digging. So, stay a while and come find the rest of it.